Welcome back, everybody, to the A Little Less Fear podcast, the Dr. Lino Show. I would love to welcome Jim Brosnahan, a member of the California Trial Lawyers Hall of Fame, is a federal prosecutor and a defense lawyer. Gender discrimination, freedom of the press, voting rights, refugees, sexual harassment, false imprisonment. Mention any headline in the nightly news, and legal legend James Brosnahan has tried a case. Now, Brosnahan offers us a front row seat in the courtroom as he goes before the bar with his memoir, Justice at Trial, Courtroom Battles and Groundbreaking Cases. Justice at Trial follows Brosnahan's career of 150 jury trials, taking us through the demanding, often controversial, and suspenseful world of jury trials, tense appeals, filled courtrooms, locked jail cells, corporate boardrooms. Each chapter follows a different case, including refugees in the Mexican border, gender battles inside one of the largest corporations in the world, sexual taboos on national television, accusations of terrorism, government agents who cheat, innocent prisoners in jails, the constitutional right to speak and print the truth, bringing law to a war zone, poverty and murder on Native American reservations, hunger in America, and more. James, welcome to the A Little Less Fear podcast. Such an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So, hey, before we started recording here, I was telling Jim here briefly about my medical history. And those that are tuning in for the first time, I survived a rare genetic disease called Muckle-Wells syndrome, statistically 1 in a million. And I'm on, hopefully will be on full remission soon. And so then Jim basically told me, it's also in his book. Here's the book right here, Justice at Trial. It's also in his book where he describes his childhood, where he spent 3 years confined to a bed. And he was basically telling me how that helped shape his personality and the rest of his life. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, I'd be happy to briefly. When I was 3, a doctor diagnosed me. I was running a fever, and he decided I had rheumatic fever with possible heart involvement. And he told my mother that we ought to keep him in bed until we see how this develops. I was in bed from 3 to almost 6. And my father, when I growing up, I really didn't think we were poor. I did a lot of work when I was a kid, but I didn't think we were poor. Writing the book, I realized we didn't have much money, that's for sure. If that's poor, it was poor. So my father finally got the money for a second opinion. And the doctor said, things get better or they get worse. They don't stay the same. Let the kid up. And so I was allowed to get up, and I went to the first grade, but I couldn't read. And my father really had been my savior during that period. He'd come home from work, and we listened to the old radio programs and things of that kind. And he was my contact with the outside world. So that was my beginning. And on your second point, which is maybe more important, did that somehow affect my life as a everyday trial lawyer going to court, trying cases and all that? It did. I always wanted to be, and then I was out there involved in the world, involved in what really mattered to clients. And that's the point of the law is here you have this client, you're going to do the best you can for them. Sometimes it's close to impossible, but maybe you can make it a little better. You win, sometimes you lose, but you've tried your best. And I spent 60 years trying to understand what trial lawyers are supposed to do. What are we supposed to be doing in, as you say, some very complex cases, including a presidential cover-up and some of the other things that I was involved in, but I was always learning. And in the back of my mind, I think I was always glad to be out there in the world and not confined.
Mm-hmm. And so by being out there in the world and doing what you did and for the last 60 years, that helped you not feel confined the way you did those 3 years of your childhood.
That's exactly right. There were moments when I couldn't believe my luck to be involved in the law, one form or another. It might be a trial, it might be lecturing, which I did a lot of. I taught at Berkeley Law School for 10 years. All those things to me were an exciting reaffirmation of the fact that I had moved past that rough. It was rough, I'd say. A lot of kids have rougher lives than I did, but
Sure.
it was rough.
I can imagine it's rough, especially ages 3 to 6. Those are really, really strong emotionally, physically, mentally, developmental stages, and you were confined to a bed. I can imagine that must have also been really hard on you physically, not just mentally and emotionally. I can imagine.
I think it was. I always wondered if I grew tall. I'm 6'3" plus.
Wow.
Maybe it
Wow.
helped me that way. But interestingly enough, you'd be interested in this, I think. The COVID kids that were at home the last 3 years,
Uh-huh.
they were suffering things that sound to me like what I went through. Those kids don't have the social interaction. They're not making friends particularly. They're at home, they're confined. They're not developing their social skills. They're certainly not starting preschool or anything of that kind. And there are studies going on about that. It just sounds a little bit familiar to me.
Since it sounds familiar to you, what do you remember as far as developing these social skills after not socializing for those young 3 years, those 3 years of your youth? What did you go through and how did you overcome that?
Well, I didn't develop my social skills all that well, frankly, in the early years. I was in a Catholic school, and in the fourth grade, as my parents told me, that the teacher liked me so much she wanted me to stay with her an extra year, and so I was okay. And I'm in the back row reading the religious text and so forth for the second time, and I really didn't want to be there. But then I got lucky, and I was able to skip the eighth grade very briefly, and I went to high school, a private high school. My father couldn't afford, but he got me in there. I don't know how he did that. Where I played three sports. Guess what? I was good at all three sports, and
What
and
were
that
those sports?
yeah, and I'm one of those, who got admitted to Boston College, proudly carrying my D-minus average from high school. And I was invited to play three sports at Boston College. I played two, basketball and baseball. But the point is that to keep my scholarship in basketball, I thought I better study, which I had really never been able to do for a whole year.
Mhm.
And I started to study. I got an A in a math test. I got a 98 in a philosophy examination. I could think, and I loved it. I just, wow, why didn't they tell me this in grade? I'm sure they did, and I didn't,
Yeah.
my mind was off somewhere.
Yeah.
And and that was it. So I got very good grades and got to law school. And there I went, and there's a whole story as to why I decided to be a lawyer and not a baseball player, because I had a tryout with the Red Sox when I was 17.
That's
But
awesome. Wow.
yeah, it was I loved the adrenaline of sports. Oh my, it was
Oh yeah,
great.
it's fun. But why law?
Um, there were no lawyers in our family. All the way back, big Irish family, but no lawyers. And so my dad and I were watching in college hearings involving Joseph McCarthy, who was a communist detective, and he would find people he'd claim they were communists at a time when that was like a death
Oh
statement,
yeah,
almost.
right.
And I watched this going on, and a man named Welch from an old law firm in Boston, when his young lawyer was attacked by McCarthy for being a communist because he joined the ACLU, so he must be a communist. And Welch, this older guy, looked across the table on national television and he said, "Have you no shame?"
Wow.
And that was the beginning of the end of McCarthy. And I sat there with my dad and I thought, that looks like real fun. That's like sports,
Right.
it's competitive and all
Yeah.
that. So I explored it at college, joined the debating society, found I loved it. I love to express myself. I'm not embarrassed to say it. Even now,
Agree.
here I
Yeah.
am, right? I'm
There's nothing
talking.
wrong with that whatsoever. There's nothing
Yeah,
wrong with that at all.
yeah, if I may say so, it turned out I was pretty good at that. And so that was it. I decided to be a lawyer and I went to law school and here I am.
And when did you decide to become a trial lawyer?
That's the interesting thing. That was right at the beginning. I didn't know there was anything else. There are wonderful corporate lawyers and trademarks and copyrights and wills
Oh
and
yeah.
very important things. But I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And so I started, someone gave me a biography of a trial lawyer, and I read that and what he did in his cases and all. And I thought, this is very exciting. And that's what I'm going to be. And that was 1954. And here I am. And I have been a trial lawyer. I'm retired now, but and have time to write my book. But that's what I was all those years. And the challenges, the risks, there's a lot of risk. You can lose an important case for the client. The clients are everything. They are the most important part of it, as I learned as I got into the practice. And you have to do your best for them, even
Oh yeah.
whether they deserve it or frankly, sometimes they don't deserve it.
Sure.
But for a client, you do your best.
What do you mean by sometimes they don't deserve it?
Well, you get in, it's not limited to criminal law, but in the civil law, they're not necessarily the nicest people. It may not be their fault. It may be their upbringing. It may be a mental illness that they have. There's so much mental illness in the criminal practice. It's common, and it's, of course, all kinds of grades. It may be so debilitating the person can't stand trial
I
at
see.
that moment, at
Uh-huh.
least. But yeah, you have to deal with all kinds of people. But I had one advantage. This is my last point here on this section. But I have worked every kind of job. There's not a job you can think of I didn't work. I drove a cab. I laid blacktop on highways. I worked in an underpass juggling stone and as a construction worker. I worked behind counters and I did just about every kind of job, and that helped me with real people. And I loved that, and I enjoyed that. I'm about as socially mobile as anybody you're likely to meet. I mean, I have represented the bottom of the folks, and I have walked among some pretty fancy dudes. And
Love that, Jim. So
yeah,
basically, your experience with working from the bottom up is that you got the ability, you got the quality time with everyday people, and that actually pushed you towards your passion of doing what you do, what you did for the last 60 years with even more integrity and more love because you were down there before and you were able to talk to these people more at their level. Is this correct?
that's absolutely correct. I had a job in construction in Somerville, Massachusetts. I grew up in Boston, and we'd gather together at 7:45, to start at 8, and there'd be conversation. No sentence would go without blasphemy or swearing or
Sure.
something.
Sure, I can imagine.
I swear, if they got through a sentence and they hadn't used the F word, they'd go back and put it in.
Right.
And so I lived in that world,
Mhm.
and others at other levels, while at the same time I was studying philosophy at Boston College and many other things.
Uh-huh.
and then at law school. And so I was socially mobile beyond. I mean, I worked this construction job I just mentioned to you. I was in my second year at law school. So
That's incredible.
yeah. Well, if you want money in your pocket, it's good. It's good to work when you're at my economic level, which I was as a kid.
Absolutely, I agree with you right there. So you've got some incredible chapters in your book here, and I wanted to know on chapter 11 here, titled "An Awesome Woman Successfully Stands Up to a Powerful Man." Why did you feel this was an important chapter to include, and what about this trial sticks out for you the most?
I think that the trial, the most important point was the wonderful bravery and courage, really, of my client. Her name is Patty Dunn. She's passed away since that time. And she had worked her way up from modest beginnings to higher positions within a bank. And then she worked in a company called Barclay, which some of your viewers may be familiar with. It's a humongous company, huge, one of the biggest companies in the world. And she became the chairperson and the chief executive officer of Barclays, and was ranked, as they say, among the top women CEOs in the country. And then she agreed to be the chairman of the board of Hewlett Packard, which is another huge company. And this man was on the board. One thing led to another, and he decided he was going to ruin her. And he was at one time at the top of the financial people in the United States. And he hired a team of lawyers and public relations people, and started getting stories written about her to the effect that she had somehow invaded someone's privacy, which at that time and this time is still a very important thing. If you say, somebody invaded your privacy, that's a serious matter. And suddenly she was on the cover of Time magazine, and with a terrible picture. And the thing about her was, though, she never complained about being attacked, and she never complained about the terminal illness that she suffered at the same time. And I admired her greatly. I put it in the book for a number of reasons, one of which was the timeliness of males thinking they're going to run over women. And the book is an interesting story. I think it's very interesting, actually, because on my advice, after she was indicted, she went on 60 Minutes and she fought back. And trust me, there's no lawyer, if any lawyer is watching this program, they will agree that you just never put someone on television, the current presidential candidates to one side, by the way, but you just never do that because they can use it against you. I thought she could do it, and she did. She spoke in front of 14 million people on 60 Minutes. And not too long after, there was a dinner where she got the Businesswoman of the Year award. After she's indicted, it was 500 people at the Fairmont Hotel, including the governor was there. And when she was introduced, they gave her a standing ovation. So she was a fighter, and she wasn't going to buckle in. It was an honor to meet her, never mind represent her.
How long did that trial go for?
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, how long did that trial go for?
We got the case dismissed after a lot of back and forth. We convinced the powers that be in the California Attorney General's office that their predecessor, who had indicted her, had misunderstood the law of privacy, and that it really wasn't a crime. It shouldn't be a crime.
Mhm.
And so she was exonerated, in my opinion, according to that, and returned to her her life. Although she had lost her position in the corporation, they terminated her. She took a real hit, but the story is in the book.
Jim, how do you usually get these cases? Who hands them to you? Do you choose them? Do they come to you? How does this usually happen?
Well, it's a maturation over time, and as I said, I practiced for 60 years. Yeah, you do the best you can for the clients that you have,
Mhm.
and the word gets out there. Now, we live in an age where you can see advertisements on TV for especially plaintiffs, personal injury lawyers, and so forth. But the reputation of a lawyer can grow or it cannot grow. And that puts a lot of pressure on the lawyer, not just to win, which is big, that's important.
Sure.
That's my standard, by the way. You say so-and-so's a lawyer, are they good? What do you think? Do they win? Not everything, not everything,
Sure.
but do they win? And you build that reputation. Interestingly enough, I think I mentioned this in the book, as you progress, and if you're fortunate and you're lucky, then the cases get harder and harder. And then finally, the greatest honor you can have is to be given the impossible case that nobody can win.
Right.
Guess what? And clients want magic. But the key point in at a certain time in your career, if you're lucky, you're on what I call the list. Who should we get? And somebody has a list, and on the list are 6 names. What about this one? What about that one? Does this person understand our industry in a civil case? Would this one be good? I mean, does he win criminal cases? And all of that is out there. A lot of it is hearsay. Some of it's not reliable. It's a little bit like fine art, gee, I like it, I'm going to buy it. I got to have it.
Right.
And it's a little bit like that.
What is and what was the longest trial you were on?
The longest trial I had was a little bit over 6 months, and it was representing a Mexican widow, 60-year-old Mexican widow, lived in Nogales, Mexico. And she, as a church worker in the Catholic Church in Nogales, helped refugees coming from Guatemala and El Salvador. And there were 11 defendants. And that number one. And number two, there was the translation.
Oh, I can
Most
imagine
of
that.
the witnesses were speaking Spanish and not English. So everything had to be translated. And we were there for 6 months. The judge was against us in a very strong way, and he ruled out our defense. And I don't want to take a lot of time with our defense, but contrary to everything you see on TV, refugees who have been threatened in certain specific ways in a statute in the United States are entitled to come into the United States. And that was our defense. They had come not through the portals, at the main place, but they'd come over hills and this and that.
Sure.
So it was complicated, but he ruled that out, leaving us basically with no defense, and we fought anyway. We did the best we could. They all got probation, and that was kind of a win, actually. And my client talking at her sentencing is in the book, and it was one of the most moving things I ever saw in the courtroom.
I can imagine. I can imagine the emotions were high as well. And I could just I can definitely feel that, especially me being a Mexican American and being
Yeah,
close to people that have come from other countries walking.
yep,
Yeah, I can imagine that that was very emotional as well.
yep.
So another chapter here that you have, chapter 16, an innocent man walks out of jail 17 years later. Why was this important for you to include? What did you gain from this?
Well, I think I'm not sure I gained anything, but the reader, what the reader might know about innocent people getting convicted is certainly reinforced by that chapter. And the details, we have this great battle going on in the United States at the moment, whether you follow science or you shouldn't follow science. It's kind of extraordinary. But science has to do with fire. There's science about detecting fire. A woman living in the house of my client, he was renting it to her family. The mother and the two children were asleep in the house, and a fire started, and they were killed. They died, and a fire inspector who was frankly a little bit over the hill and given to sudden judgments, came down, looked all around, decided, number one, it was arson. And number two, because my client had visited the day before, the police concluded within about 48 hours that he did it.
Within 48 hours, that they concluded
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, they decided that. They came in the morning. He was sleeping, and they knocked on the door at 6 o'clock in the morning. And as they sometimes do, they're very polite, they're very kind, and you lost your house, and that's terrible. Maybe you would come with us down to the station and we can get a full report. He was in custody from that moment until 17 years later. And the Innocence Project, which is a famous group of dedicated people. Can I step back for a second? One of the reasons I wanted to write this book is I want people to hear more about the lawyers who are out there doing wonderful work at less money than they could get elsewhere. And there are thousands of them. These are lawyers. And so I found opportunities to put that in. In any event, it turned out that the science, in quotes, about arson was wrong. There was modern science, modern testing that showed it was wrong. And as we got ready to try the murder case, because the DA was adamant they were going to retry the case. A federal judge had said, you either have to let him go or you have to retry the case. And they were serious about letting it go. We came in, our team, George Harris and others, and we gutted their case. Basically, we got their case knocked out and so forth. They still were going to try the case. They're going to do all this. And in the book, I tell the story, but I will tell you this much. Of all the moments, really, with prisoners that I've had, and I've had a lot of moments with prisoners, looking through the glass in the jail and seeing my client without shackles, which he always had worn every other time I visited with him. He always had these heavy shackles, standing in civilian clothes for the first time in 17 years.
Wow.
And he came out, and his sister was there, his two sons were there. His sister never gave up on him. These stories of what happens in prisons are extraordinary. Often they are. If they have somebody, as he did, and he was out of jail, and that story is in the book. And I'm glad I put it there. I put it there to answer your question because people need to know more about the frailties of criminal law. It's very often correct. It's very often right about convictions, but it's also the number of people who've been wrongly convicted is a significant number.
Oh, I've heard and I've seen so many documentaries on this, and it's really heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking how common this is. Sometimes even with the most minor things that people have been convicted of, that get so long, so many years, and then be wrongfully convicted at the end. It's sad, it's painful. But
It
I'm
is.
still wondering, Jim, though, because I can imagine that you did learn something from this. You did grow from this. You did gain something from an experience like that.
Well, I think there are times when the lawyer has to go home and look in the mirror and say, "I'm a very lucky person.
Sure.
I never had anything like this happen to
Yeah.
me." And so there is that aspect of it. I think it spices up the cross-examination of the criminal defense lawyer in other cases when you're part of a case like this. They can be wrong. The prosecutors, some can be very righteous. I mean, they're going to give us law and order, and you better look out. And but many of them are just conscientious, and that's the work they do. But I think it gives you energy to fight other cases as well, because your job
Right.
is to make sure that doesn't happen to somebody else.
Jim, I'm wondering what it feels like for you to walk into a courthouse as a trial lawyer. What does it feel like for you? Do you get an adrenaline rush? Do you get nervous? Do you ever get nervous, especially after 60 years? What is it like for you?
Well, adrenaline is my drug of choice. I don't have any other drugs, okay? But adrenaline is my drug of choice. And, to walk into a courtroom early, it might be 7 in the morning, and sit down. I joke with sheriffs or bailiffs or federal marshals if they're there. We chat about the Giants baseball team, whatever it might be. The judge might be around before he puts or she puts their robes on, and we chat a little bit about things and all of that. That atmosphere is, and I haven't made this up for an interview. I love that atmosphere, and being there is a privilege. It's I remember when I first thought, go back, way back to your first question, is when I thought about being a lawyer, you know what I got stuck on? They call you Esquire. And I thought, that's fantastic. I'll be an Esquire. And you just feel before the action begins, then the door closes. The judge is up sitting up front, the jury's in the box, then you fight like hell and you give it all you can with subtlety at times, not so subtle, and whatever is called upon to do.
And what does it take to be a successful trial lawyer?
Well, I taught a class at Berkeley Law for 10 years, and the class was to develop their skills from any timidity they might have or caution in their voice. I teach voice, and it's a very important skill. And I tell them at the first class that we can develop your skills. It's your skills that matter. I can tell you that over the 10 years, without exception, they have developed their skills. So I have this point of view that if you're going to work on it, you can develop your skills. But I think competition, experience in competition, waiting on tables or behind a counter, dealing with humans, some of whom are in good mood, some of whom are in a terrible mood, is very valuable. And so I think those are the things. But if do you want to be part of a world of rules? Do you like rules? I mean, do you think rules are good? Do you want to reform things? A lot of young people go into law because they want to reform A or B or C or D or E, and good luck to them, and they should. So those are some of the things that matter.
What about voice? Let's go back to that. What about voice does somebody need to work on?
What I have a post I put up yesterday in LinkedIn.
Okay.
I'm giving it a little plug. And what it is some exercises for voice. But here's what I learned. I've been teaching for many, many years, in addition to all my cases. And what I found was that a great many lawyers and law students are nervous to some extent, from slight to serious, about their voice. These are practicing lawyers that go to court and talk. So the next question I had years ago was, are we teaching voice? Because you can teach voice. And the answer, by and large, in law schools is no. The result is poor old judges have to sit there and listen to lawyers whining. I mean, it's terrible. Judges hate that. So I started teaching, and I've taught, I'm guessing, but it's about 2,000 lawyers and law students, a lot of it one-on-one. Why don't you try this? Read that again. And a lot of them just are very flat, especially the law students. They're very flat. It's like they don't want to risk, getting excited or, whatever. And the question is, when you talk, do people want to hear you talk? I mean, that's the question. So I put exercises up on LinkedIn, and I'm going to follow up with some other things. There's a vast pool of people out there. I'm not charging for it. I mean, it's just my idea about how to improve your voice. But there's a vast pool of people out there that think they can improve their voices, and they are correct. They are right about that.
I definitely agree with you on that. And when you mean improve your voice, you're talking about how to be a little bit more engaging, how to be more connecting, how to be a little bit more assertive, a little bit more confident, or all of the above?
All of those things. The confident part is, the way to do that is to practice. I'm convinced that that works. And I did a lot of that when I was a young lawyer. I still do it to some extent. So you have to practice. It's like anything else in life. I mean, you want to play baseball, or you want to play soccer. I mean, you don't just wander out on the court and start kicking the ball.
Right.
The 10 years old are practicing right now for great fame in the future. And so, but the specifics involve tempo, for example. How fast are you speaking? And that's a habit. If I say you need to slow down, that's not easy.
No, it's not.
You have to practice that. Clarity. Are the words clear? Pauses. Are you afraid to make a pause? You think someone will think you don't know what you're going to say next? Or wouldn't this work? You're a criminal prosecutor. Wouldn't this work? He was in the room. He held the gun. There was smoke coming out of the barrel. And there was a body on the floor. It's not hard in theory. But when you say, I'm going to break my bad habits of speech, look out, because you're going to have to work on that. It's a habit.
It is a habit. I went through that myself with podcasting, especially after losing my voice and then gaining back my voice.
No
There were times where I often noticed that I was talking a lot and really fast because I was afraid my vocal cords would get painful. So,
Yeah.
and which they were. But what I realized after listening to myself again over and over is that there were times, especially when my adrenaline's really high or when I'm really hyper, that I start to speak really, really fast and stumble on my own words. But the slower I speak and the more that I feel what I'm speaking, the words that are coming out, the more clarity that I have and the more present I am in that moment. And it's really beautiful once that happens, once that connection happens.
It is.
And what about personality coming through with voice? Do you encourage that as well?
I do. And I'm not telling them how to talk like Brosnahan. That's not the point. It's their voice that's here. And what we want is variation. And try it. That's the beauty of the class when I taught it, is try it. We're all friends here. Nobody's going to make fun of you. So try it, and I'll give you an example. Emotion. You're not using any emotion at all. Everything is the same. You're not committing to anything. But what would you do if your client needed some emotion? Well, my parents don't use emotion. Or the voice inside the students are, I don't do, that's not me. That's not me. No, of course it's not you, but it can become you, and you'll
Sure.
have another tool
Right,
in
right.
persuading people. So let's try it. Well, okay, I'm going to use emotion. I'm emotional now. Let's try it a little more.
Yeah.
Give me a little bit more emotion. How did that feel? Well, I'm kind of getting used to it. You see what the process is. It's crucial, and it's not in very many law schools.
When did you realize that you had your own voice? How long did it take before you actually felt comfortable with your voice?
When I joined the Fulton Debating Society at Boston College, I was comfortable my first day. And that kind of undercuts all this work on voice that I'm talking about, but not really. I felt comfortable with it, but Lord knows what I sounded like. I don't really know. I guess what I'm really saying is I enjoyed talking.
Mhm.
I really liked expressing myself. And I think part of that goes back to the 3 years in bed. Who am I going to
Right.
talk to? I talk to my father, I talk to my mother, and that was my grandparents would come sometimes, but that was about it.
Jim, I'd like to talk about the word justice. What did justice mean to you when you first started, and what does it mean to you now?
I wanted to do it when I started. I knew there was injustice. I could see it. I mean, economic injustice was quite visible in Boston in the 1950s, and I sympathized with that. I could see it. It's not fair. It's not right. And I uh, saw a lot of things that needed to be reformed. Uh, where I am today, all these years later, is I know that although the word is talked about all the time and is sometimes over the courthouse door, justice and
Hmm.
so forth, nobody really knows what it means. I
Right.
mean, they don't.
Right.
They know that's not it, or they know, yes, that's right. And I just finished dare I say, dull 50-page article that includes the answer to your question, what justice
Really?
is. Yeah, because that's my next book will have a chapter on justice, my views of it. And justice is probably a proportion of a reaction to something that is perceived as an issue. Now, that's pretty broad and vague and general, but judges are doing this all the time and not using the word, but they're trying to do that. So here's the defendant, and they did something. Now they're being sentenced, but there were circumstances that are part of that are not in the statute. And given the background of the person, probably justice, the judge thinks, would be a little less if they have the discretion to do it. That is done every day in courthouses all over the United States. That's what judges are doing. They're not reading the politics of things. There are exceptions,
Hmm.
but those are, I want to say, rare, really. I think most judges are trying to do the right thing every day, all day.
Sure.
And justice is an incentive to try to do the right thing in the specific case. This case, it doesn't have anything to do with other cases, although uniformity is part of justice, but it's not the best part of justice.
What is the best part of justice?
The correct application of a penalty of some kind or a sanction of some kind being appropriate to the application of the person in front of the judge. Courtroom justice. There's economic justice, and there's all kinds of justice outside the court. But in the courtroom, it's the application of an appropriate sanction, if you will, or a penalty of some kind that bears a resemblance. And you have, every day you'll have cases where that was not true, the penalty was way too big, and it should be reduced, says the appellate court, which is overlooking all this. But justice is, you've brought up the most important part of the court system, is the application of something called for by the law to this particular defendant or these defendants. It's very difficult.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Not easy, yeah.
What has been your biggest challenge being a trial lawyer?
Well, I got tired writing the book. I mean, I'm thinking, I did all this, and I'm not kidding. It's like, how did I do that? And I did this. It all comes back. I have a good memory for transactions and events and stuff, and so it all came back. And I'm thinking, what I used to do. I don't know if you folks will be interested in this, but I would get very tired, and I'm like 47 years old, and I would say, I started saying, I'm going to do this 5 more years. And then I started doing 3 more. I'm going to do 3 more years because I really love it. Adrenaline is just what keeps me going. That's what kept me going. And then I started on a 1-year turnaround. Now I'm in my 80s. And I'm deciding, how long I'm going to do this. And to my credit, if I want to put it that way, I thought it really is time for me to not take new clients. It's appropriate. And besides, I want to write a book. And so that's what I did. The strain is enormous. You mentioned the 6-month sanctuary trial, the widow from Mexico. That was living in a hotel in
wow.
I think I came home 3 or 4 times to Berkeley, but I was there. All of the lawyers were down there for 6 months. I mean, that's an enormous strain.
That is.
You're not seeing the kids, and which I always want to do. And so I don't want to whine anymore about it, but it's a very hard life that way.
That is a hard life. And what actually kept you going at that time, being away from your family for 6 months and the kids? I mean, what helped you get through all that?
Well, Carol came down with one or the other of the kids and would spend a weekend. She's, if I didn't mention it, she was a judge for 40 years in Alameda County. So she had to be in court Monday through Friday. But she would come down and we'd talk on the phone just about every night. One thing I learned, by the way, which is kind of irrelevant, is hotels serve the same food. So if you're in a hotel for 6 months, you're saying each night, to the nice person on the phone, I'll have the chicken with the raspberry sauce on the side,
Oh, goodness.
Oh my goodness. But what they did have in Tucson, Arizona, where that case was, they have some of the best Mexican food you're going to find.
Oh, I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. That was good.
Jim Brosnahan, everybody, his incredible book, Justice at Trial, Courtroom Battles and Groundbreaking Cases. Where can our viewers or watchers and our listeners find your book?
Well, it's on Amazon. It was on there this morning. It's being carried as a bestseller since before it came out on July 15th. So that's a nice thing to get started with. But then you can order it at any bookstore nationwide, and it'll come in about 7 days. It has a little bit of a buzz to it, I think, and the sales seem to be going along very nicely at the moment. So we'll see what happens. I really want young people who are either young lawyers or law students who are thinking about law to read my version of Lawyers. I mean, I don't know if you ever told a lawyer's story, but everybody else has, It's like the lawyer comes into the bar and there's an alligator or a rabbi and and the rabbi eats the alligator and the lawyer eats both of them, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. And I understand that, but there's an important side to law that I've seen. I'm a witness. I saw it time and time again of lawyers who are dedicated to some cause, and they're working on that their whole lives, and it's not it's very real. I've seen it, and I hope the book reads well. I think maybe it does. It has a lot of
It reads well. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I hope so.
It's got a nice flow. It's easy to understand, and it doesn't feel overbearing at all. It grasps you and it makes you want to keep going.
I don't think there's a legal term in the whole book. If there is, I immediately explained it. But I
Right.
wrote it I wanted to demystify the law for people.
And that's exactly the feels. Jim Brosnahan, everybody, thank you so much for sharing your incredible journey with me and all our viewers, our watchers, and our listeners on A Little Less Fear podcast. Wishing you tons of success on your next book. You said your next book is going to be on justice?
Yes, it's going to have a big chapter on justice where I give my version of it, and but it's going to have other things like the rule of law, for example, is mentioned all the time. The rule of law, this is breaking the rule of law. Nobody knows what it means. And what's included in the law, that's for another day. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure and it was an honor. Have a great rest of your day now.
Okay, thank you. I will.